The Dakota Territory, winter of 1887. The cold wasn't just weather, it was a law. And for a woman with no husband, no rights, and a child on the way, it was a death sentence. Her in-laws had just cast her out into the snow to claim the farm for themselves, leaving her to freeze on the open prairie. But a mile away, a man who spoke only with his hands was about to build a different kind of justice. Her name was Ilara Vance, 26 years old, 5 months pregnant, and now legally a ghost. Under the law of coverture, her identity died with her husband, leaving his family to claim every board and acre. But out here, survival writes its own rules, and the man they called the Silent Cowboy was about to break them all. This is the true story of how the cruelest winter on record forged an unbreakable bond, and how a cabin built by hand became a landmark of defiance against an entire town. Ilara's crime was simple. She survived. Her husband, Thomas, had taken a fever after a logging accident and was gone within a week. The Vance family saw not tragedy but opportunity. Under the common law that still held sway in the territory, a widow was a legal non-entity. The 160-acre homestead, the small herd, the timber claim, all of it passed to Thomas's bloodline, to his father, his brothers. Ilara was entitled to a widow's third, a theoretical share, but only if the family willed it. They did not. The eviction was delivered not with shouts, but with cold procedure. Thomas's elder brother Harlan stood on her porch 2 days after the burial, a folded paper in his hand. It was a notice, drawn up by a friendly judge in the county seat, declaring her a tenant at will. She had until the end of the month to vacate. The baby is a Vance, she had pleaded, her hand on her swelling belly. Harlan had merely looked past her, assessing the roof line. The child will be provided for once it's born. You are not our concern. For 3 weeks she lived in a state of suspended terror. She performed her chores under their watchful eyes. Every pot she used, every log she burned, tallied against her. They moved her from the bedroom to the storage loft. They took the team horse, claiming it was needed for spring planting on their own plot. The final morning dawned with a sky the color of iron. A sleeting rain had frozen overnight, sheathing the world in glass. Harlan arrived with their father, Old Man Vance. They did not enter. They simply stood at the door, their breath plumbing in the sharp air. Time's up, Ilara. The wagon's hitched. We'll take you to the station. You can wire your people back east. She had no people back east. They knew this. Her family had been lost to cholera on the journey out. Thomas was her people, and now he was gone. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, the words barely forming. That, Harlan said, is not our problem. They did not touch her. They didn't have to. Their presence in the doorway, the loaded wagon behind them, was the only command needed. She gathered what she could: a wool shawl, a tin cup, the locket with a blurry daguerreotype of Thomas, a single change of clothes grown tight around the middle. They watched her silent as she placed the bundle in the wagon bed. Then, as the wagon began to roll toward the lane, she stopped. She turned and looked at the cabin, smoke still wisping from the chimney she had lit that morning. She took one step back toward it. Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. You get in this wagon, or you walk. But you are leaving this land. She looked from his hard face to the vast, white expanse of the prairie, stretching uninterrupted to a horizon blurred by falling snow. The station was 17 miles east. The nearest town, a shabby collection of saloons and supply posts called Bitter Creek, was 8 miles due north, a path cutting across open land, a path that passed near the foothills. Without a word, she reached into the wagon, took her small bundle, and stepped away. Suit yourself, Old Man Vance muttered. She heard the crack of the reins, the creak of the wagon turning, and then she was alone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind hissing through the frozen grass. She pulled the shawl over her head and began to walk north. The man in the foothills had a name, but few used it. Most in Bitter Creek referred to him as Holt, or simply the Cowboy. He had arrived 5 years prior, a young man then, trailing the ghosts of some unspecified war, not the grand national one, but a smaller, more personal conflict that had left its marks behind his eyes. He'd filed a claim on a rocky, marginal piece of land everyone else had passed over, land that butted against the northern edge of the Vance property. He paid for it with a heavy bag of gold dust, asked no questions, and offered no answers. He built a lean-to, then a corral, and finally, over 2 back-breaking years, a single-room cabin of hand-hewn logs. He worked a small herd of scrub cattle, traded hides for salt and shot, and came to town only for essentials. His interactions were transactions, completed in as few syllables as possible. The community's judgment was a shrug. He was odd but harmless. And in a land where everyone had a past they were running from, his silence was respected. Holt had seen the funeral procession from a distance, a black speck moving across the white field. He'd known Thomas Vance in the way men know neighbors in sparse country, a nod across a shared fence line, a borrowed tool returned. He'd seen the woman, Ilara too, hanging wash in the summer sun, a small, diligent figure. He understood the mechanics of law and property well enough to know what her husband's death likely meant for her. It was none of his business. Until, on that razor-edged morning, it became his business. He was checking his trap line along the tree fringe when he saw the movement, a dark, slow speck against the relentless white, far from any road. At first he thought it was a stray cow bewildered by the storm, but the shape was wrong. He stood still, his breath frosting the wool of his scarf. It was a person moving with the labored, swaying gait of profound exhaustion or injury, instinct warred with a hard-learned doctrine of non-interference. The plains taught you that some journeys were meant to end. To intervene was to take on a burden you might not be able to put down. He turned back toward his cabin. He took 3 steps. He stopped. Cursing under his breath, he changed direction, striking out on a diagonal to intercept the figure's path. The cold had begun to metabolize into something else inside Ilara, a deep, seductive numbness. The pain in her feet had faded. The frantic hammering of her heart had slowed to a lazy, stumbling rhythm. The baby, which had been a constant, fluttering presence, had gone still. This last fact should have terrified her, but it only registered as a distant observation. It would be so easy to sit down, just for a moment, to rest against that large, wind-sculpted rock. The thought was a whisper, warm and promising. She was so close. The smoke plume from Holt's chimney was a gray smudge in the distance, maybe half a mile. It felt like a continent away. Her legs buckled. Not a dramatic collapse, but a gentle, inevitable folding. She sank into a snowdrift that curled around her like a cold embrace. She closed her eyes. The world shrank to the sound of her own slowing breath. The shadow that fell over her was solid, blocking the scouring wind. She forced her eyes open. A man stood above her, his form a dark silhouette against the bleached sky. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat of oiled canvas and sheepskin, a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. He didn't speak. He simply knelt, his movements deliberate and calm. He pulled a glove off with his teeth and pressed bare, calloused fingers to the side of her throat, feeling for a pulse. His touch was startlingly warm. He looked from her face to her bundled form, his gaze lingering on the unmistakable curve of her belly beneath the layers of wool and patched coat. His expression, what little she could see of it under the hat's shadow, didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted, a calculation, a surrender. Without a word, he slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders, and lifted her from the snow as if she weighed nothing. He turned and began the long, trudging walk back toward the thin line of smoke, leaving her small, dark imprint in the snow to be filled in by the wind. He carried her across his own threshold, into the dim, smoky warmth of the cabin, and laid her on the narrow bed by the stone fireplace. He had just broken his first rule. He had no idea it would condemn him to break every other one he had left. The first thing she felt was pain, a deep, aching cold burning away into 1,000 pinpricks of fire in her hands and feet. The second was the smell of wood smoke, rabbit grease, and damp wool. Ilara opened her eyes to a low, log-beamed ceiling, the light from a stone hearth painting everything in moving orange shadows. She was buried under a weight of blankets and furs. A tin cup of something steaming sat on a stump beside the bed. She tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness forced her back down. A movement to her left. Holt stood by the fireplace, stirring a small pot. He didn't look over. He simply said, "Drink." Her hands shook too badly to lift the cup. He saw this, crossed the room in 2 strides, picked it up and held it to her lips without a word. The liquid was bitter, hot, and tasted of pine needles and whiskey. It scalded a path down her throat and kindled a feeble warmth in her core. "The baby," she croaked, her voice a stranger's. He nodded once, a short, sharp motion. "Kicking an hour ago, fierce." The relief that flooded her was so profound it felt like a new kind of weakness. She began to cry, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Holt looked profoundly uncomfortable. He set the cup down, returned to the fire, and gave the pot another stir. "Soup's near ready," he said, as if that explained everything. For 3 days she lived in a fog of recovery. The cabin was a single room, stark and utilitarian. a bed, a table, 2 stools, a chest, shelves holding meager supplies, a rifle hung over the door. His world was one of pure function. He fed her, changed the damp cloths on her feet where the frost had bitten, and wordlessly provided for her needs. He slept on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in his coat. They exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences. She learned his name was Holt. He learned nothing new about her because he asked nothing. On the 4th morning, strength seeping back into her limbs, shame arrived in its place. She was a burden, consuming his food, his firewood, his solitude. She stood by the table, her hands resting on the rough wood. "I should go," she said, not knowing where that could possibly be. Holt was hunting a skinning knife on a leather strap. He didn't pause his rhythmic scraping. "Go where?" It wasn't a question. "I can't stay," she insisted, the words hollow. He finally looked up, his eyes the color of the slate sky outside. "You can't walk. The Vances are watching the roads. Stay." He said it like stating a weather fact. The decision, it seemed, had been made. And so a new, fragile routine began. As her body healed, her mind grappled with the silence. It was a physical presence in the cabin, thicker than the smoke. In her old life, there had always been sound, Thomas's voice, the livestock, the wind in the eaves. Here the quiet was absolute, broken only by the crackle of fire, the scrape of a tool, the sigh of wind. She found herself talking just to fill it, murmuring to the baby, commenting on the soup, until she caught Holt, still, listening posture, and felt foolish. He wasn't ignoring her. He was listening so completely it was unnerving. She began to understand his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a deep, attentive pool. She started to earn her keep. She couldn't chop wood or tend the traps, but she could mend. She found a pile of his worn clothes, shirts with frayed cuffs, socks holed at the heel. She asked for needle and thread. He produced a tin from his chest. Her first stitches were clumsy, her fingers still stiff. But as she worked, a forgotten calm settled over her. She was doing something. When she handed him the first mended shirt, he examined the seam, running a thumb over the tight, even stitches. He gave a single, slow nod. It felt like a commendation. A week in, the isolation began to whisper to her. The 4 walls seemed to press closer each day. She would stare out the single window at the endless monochrome landscape, a feeling of panic rising in her chest. This was what the old-timers called prairie madness, that creeping sense of being erased by the emptiness. She fought it by imposing order. She scrubbed the table until the grain showed pale. She rearranged the shelves. She asked Holt for flour and attempted biscuits. They emerged from the Dutch oven as hard, charred lumps. She stared at them, humiliation hot in her throat. He came in from feeding the stock, brushed snow from his shoulders, and saw her failure on the table. He picked one up, tapped it against the wood. It made a solid *** sound. A ghost of something, almost a smile, touched his eyes. "Good for throwing at wolves," he said, and took a bite. He chewed methodically, swallowed, and took another. He ate 3 of them. That small, wordless act of grace was a stone dropped into the silent pool of their coexistence. The ripples changed everything. The next day, he left a chunk of salt pork and a sack of beans by the hearth, an invitation. She cooked them slowly, learning the quirks of his fire. The meal was edible. He ate 2 bowls. After supper, he did something unprecedented. He pulled the other stool closer to the fire, sat, and began to carve a piece of pine with his knife. He didn't speak, but his presence was no longer that of a warden. It was companionship. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. Holt made a supply run to Bitter Creek. He was in the general store buying shot and salt when Harlan Vance walked in. The air tightened. Harlan made a show of looking Holt up and down. "Heard you took in a stray, Holt." Holt continued weighing his purchase on the store's scale. "Heard a lot of things," he said, his voice low. "Some say she didn't make it far off our land," Harlan pressed, his tone casual, lethal. "Be a shame if there was a dispute. Property lines get fuzzy in the snow." Holt finally looked at him. He didn't blink. "My line's clear, my cabin on my land. What's in my cabin is my business." It was the longest speech anyone in Bitter Creek had ever heard from him. Harlan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking out for our interests. And that child, it's Vance blood." Holt dropped payment on the counter, collected his goods, and walked out. The message was delivered. A claim had been staked, and it was contested. He returned to the cabin grim. Ilara saw the tension in the set of his jaw as he unpacked. "What happened?" she asked. He told her bluntly. The color drained from her face. The sanctuary of the cabin suddenly felt thin, its walls mere paper against the threat of the Vances, legal ruthlessness, and social influence. I'm putting you in danger, she whispered. Holt shook his head. They were always danger, now they just know where it is. That night, for the first time, he bolted the cabin door. The following days were marked by a new vigilance. Holt spent more time near the cabin, his work always within sight of the door. He began bringing in greater stores of firewood, stacking it high against the north wall. He checked his rifle often. Ilara watched this quiet mobilization with a growing, cold understanding. He was preparing for a siege, not necessarily of bullets, but of pressure, of law, of winter itself. She asked him one evening, "What will we do if they come?" He was cleaning his gun, the parts laid out on a cloth on the table. He didn't look up. They won't get to the door. But a more immediate enemy was gathering its strength. The heart of the winter. A new storm rolled down from the mountains, howling for 3 days and nights. Snow drifted to the bottom of the window. The world shrank to the circle of firelight. Their supply of dry wood began to dwindle. On the 4th day, with the wind still screaming, Holt announced he needed to check the stock in the lean-to and bring in more wood from the covered pile. He bundled himself into his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and pushed out into the white maelstrom. The door sealed shut behind him, cutting off the shriek of the wind. An hour passed, then 2. The fire began to sink into embers. Ilara paced the small room, her worry a living thing. He should have been back. The storm was too violent. What if he'd fallen? What if he'd become disoriented and wandered into the white void? The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. She was useless in here. The baby turned restlessly inside her, a mirror to her anxiety. She went to the window, rubbed a clear spot on the fogged glass, and peered out. She could see nothing but a wall of swirling white. Then a shape, a dark, stumbling form emerging from the blur. Holt. He was moving slowly, laboriously, dragging something behind him. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by alarm. His gait was wrong. She rushed to unbolt the door as he reached it, heaving it open against the wind. He half fell inside, bringing a gust of snow and biting cold with him. He was dragging a sack of feed. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue. Got turned around, he grunted, his teeth chattering. By the creek, he'd been gone almost 3 hours in sub-zero temperatures. He shrugged off his coat, his movements clumsy. His hands were shaking violently, beyond his control. The early, insidious stages of hypothermia. Ilara didn't hesitate. She guided him to the stool by the fire, which was now far too low. "We need more heat now," he nodded, a sluggish motion. She grabbed the last of the dry, split logs from the pile and built up the fire, blowing on the embers until flames licked hungrily at the new wood. She took the pot of snow she'd been melting for water and set it close to the blaze. Then she turned to him. His shivering was becoming more violent, a body's desperate attempt to generate warmth. "Your clothes are damp," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his daze. "They have to come off." For a flicker his eyes met hers, a flash of vulnerability, of pride. Then he gave a slight nod. He was too far gone to manage the buttons. She moved in, her own fingers cold but determined. She worked the buttons of his wool shirt, then the damp long johns beneath. She averted her eyes from his person, focusing on the task. She wrapped him in the thickest fur from the bed, then dragged the stool so close to the fire the heat had to be near painful. She took the now warm water from the pot, soaked a cloth, and began to rub it vigorously over his arms, his chest, his back, anywhere she could reach through the fur, forcing circulation back to the frozen skin. She talked to him as she worked, a steady stream of nonsense. "You're a fool, Holt, a brave, stubborn fool who checks on cattle in this. They have thicker hides than you do. Just sit, just breathe." Gradually, the violent shivering subsided into deep, occasional tremors. Color began to creep back into his face. His eyes, which had gone glassy, cleared and focused on her. She was kneeling before him, her hair escaping its braid, her face flushed from exertion and heat, her hands red from the warm cloth and the work. He looked at her, really looked, and in his eyes she saw the last of his walls crumble. He saw not a burden but a rescuer, not a ghost but a force. He lifted a hand, still unsteady, and very gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was rough, warm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silent covenant between them had been rewritten. They were no longer rescuer and rescued. They were allies, stranded together in the white heart of a storm, with a world of trouble waiting outside. And they both knew the Vances wouldn't be the last or the worst of it. The winter itself was just getting started. The storm broke, leaving a world of breathless, brutal calm. The sun glared off a desert of snow so bright it hurt the eyes. In the cabin, something fundamental had shifted. Holt's recovery was swift, but the dynamic between them was forever altered. The line that had separated his space from hers blurred and then vanished. He began to leave tasks for her that required trust, not just pity. He showed her how to load the rifle, his hands guiding hers on the lever, his voice a low murmur at her ear. Safety, here, squeeze, don't pull. He pointed out landmarks from the window, the twisted pine that marked the property line, the dip in the land where the creek lay hidden under snow, giving her a map of her new, small world. She was no longer a guest. She was part of the garrison. Her pregnancy advanced, a relentless clock ticking beneath the stillness of winter. The baby's movements grew stronger, more defined. Sometimes in the evenings, Holt's gaze would drift to her rounded belly, a look of profound, almost fearful wonder on his face. One night, as a particularly vigorous kick made her jump, he spoke without looking up from his whittling. "What will you name it?" The question surprised her. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far. "I don't know," she said softly. "Thomas, if it's a boy, after his father." Holt nodded, his knife pausing. "And if it's a girl," Ilara looked into the fire, "something that means survivor." He went back to his carving. A long time later, he said, "Good." But the outside world was tightening its grip. On his next necessary trip to Bitter Creek for ammunition and the last of the winter feed, Holt returned with more than supplies. His face was a mask of controlled anger. He tossed a folded newspaper onto the table. It was the Weekly Territorial Gazette, 2 weeks old. A notice was circled in rough charcoal. It was a legal advertisement placed by Harlan Vance. Notice of intent to reclaim property. The text was dry, legalistic, claiming that personal effects of sentimental and monetary value belonging to the Vance estate were believed to be in the unlawful possession of one Ilara Vance, currently residing outside lawful jurisdiction. It was a masterstroke. It wasn't a claim on her or the baby. It was a claim on the locket, the clothes on her back, the very shawl she wore. It created a pretext. If she was harboring stolen Vance property, then any action to retrieve it could be framed as lawful recovery. "They're laying the groundwork," Holt said, his voice grim. "Next, they'll get a constable from the county seat to come knocking, a friendly one." Ilara felt the walls of the cabin, which had felt so solid, turn to paper. The law was a tool, and the Vances knew how to wield it. "What do we do?" He looked at her, then at the notice, then out at the unbroken white. "We build a fact they can't argue with." The next morning, he led her to the small, windowless lean-to behind the cabin where he stored tools and rough timber. He dragged out a massive, unfinished log, one side hewn flat. "Help me," he said. Together, they wrestled it into the clearing before the cabin door. He fetched his broadaxe, his adze, his drawknife. He did not explain. He simply began to work, transforming the raw log into a smooth, squared beam. The rhythm of his labor, the solid asterisk thwack asterisk of the axe, the long, peeling curls of wood from the drawknife, became the new heartbeat of their days. Ilara brought him water, held the beam steady, and watched as his hands, those calloused, quiet instruments, created order from chaos. She asked on the third day, "What is it for?" He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "A room," she blinked. "A room," he gestured with the axe toward the south wall of the cabin. "Off there for you and the child." The simplicity of the statement stole her breath. He wasn't just letting her stay. He was building her a place. He was making her permanent. It was an act of defiance more powerful than any shouted argument. He was building a asterisk fact asterisk. Work became their shared purpose. In the deep cold, they toiled. Holt taught her how to notch a log, how to mix the daubing mud with chopped straw to insulate the gaps. Her hands grew raw, then calloused. Her back ached, but it was a clean, honest ache of creation, not the dull throb of fear. They spoke little, but the silence between blows of the hammer was no longer empty. It was filled with shared intent. The skeleton of the new room rose from the frozen earth, a promise made of pine and resolve. It was during this fragile, hopeful time that Holt's past finally whispered its name. A man rode into the yard one afternoon, a stranger on a tired horse. He was older, dressed in the faded but decent clothes of a shopkeeper or a clerk. He had a kind, weary face. Holt saw him from the roof, where he was laying the new sod layer, and went still. Ilara, mixing daub below, felt the change in the air. Holt climbed down slowly and walked to meet the man. They spoke for a few minutes, their voices too low to hear. The stranger handed Holt a letter. Holt took it, his shoulders rigid. The man nodded once, touched the brim of his hat toward Ilara with a look of gentle pity, and rode away. Holt stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the unopened letter. Finally, he walked to the woodpile, sat heavily on a stump and broke the seal. Ilara gave him space, watching from the doorway. She saw his face as he read. Not anger, not sadness, but a profound, weary resignation. The last vestige of color drained from his cheeks. He finished, folded the letter carefully and stared at the horizon. After an eternity, he looked toward her. His voice, when it came, was rough. "My brother," he said, "he's dead, fever." He looked down at his hands. "There's a farm back in Ohio. It's mine now if I want it." He had no children. He let the words hang in the frozen air. An inheritance, a legitimate, lawful claim to a life, a way out of the hard-scrabble frontier, away from the Vances, away from the relentless struggle, a safe, settled future, on a platter. He looked at her and she knew he was not just telling her his news. He was presenting her with a choice, a door she hadn't known existed. He could go, he could take her with him. They could leave this half-built room, this contested land, this entire war behind. It was the sensible thing, the smart thing, the safe thing. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked from his haunted eyes to the rising frame of her new room, to the stark, beautiful, cruel land that had tried to kill her and was now her home. She walked over to him, took the letter from his limp fingers, and without reading it, folded it again. She walked to the fire pit, knelt, and held the corner of the paper to a still glowing ember. It caught, flared, and burned quickly to ash in her hand. She dropped the last fragment and looked up at him. "We have a room to finish," she said. Something broke in his expression then, not a collapse, but a release, a final, silent surrender to the path they were on. He stood up, walked to the half-built wall, picked up his hammer, and drove a peg home with a blow that echoed across the silent prairie. No more was said about Ohio. The final stretch of her pregnancy coincided with the deepest cold of the season. The room was sealed, roofed, and chinked. It was small, raw, and smelled of fresh-cut pine and earth. It was the most beautiful thing Ilara had ever seen. They moved her few belongings into it. That night she slept in her own space, the baby restless within her, listening to the sounds of Holt banking the fire in the main room. She felt, for the first time since Thomas died, a sense of ownership, of belonging. But the Vances were not idle. Their next move was not legal but social. The story, carefully embellished, spread through Bitter Creek. Holt had taken in the Vance widow in a state of grief-stricken confusion. He was keeping her isolated, against her will, to lay claim to the Vance child and whatever scraps of property she'd stolen. He was a predatory loner, and she was a brainwashed captive. The morality of the town, fluid on most issues, hardened against them. When Holt went for supplies next, he was met with averted eyes, muttered comments, and inflated prices. The storekeeper, once neutral, said, maybe it'd be simpler for everyone if she went back to her family, Holt. Holt paid in silence, but the noose was tightening. They were being outlawed not by statute, but by consensus. Then the blizzard hit. It was the storm of the season, predicted by the old-timers and the aching in Holt's healed frostbite. It rolled in at dusk, a wall of white that swallowed the world whole. By nightfall, the wind was a screaming beast, and the snow drifted past the windowsill. They were prepared, stocked with wood and food, sealed in their pine fortress. But Ilara's time had come. The first pain seized her as she was adding a log to the fire. It was a deep, wrenching cramp that stole her breath and doubled her over. She knew instantly it was too early, by weeks. The panic was immediate and metallic in her mouth. Holt was at her side in an instant, his hand steadying her. "The baby?" he asked, his voice tight. She could only nod, gasping as the pain receded, leaving terror in its wake. "It's too soon," she managed to whisper. There was no midwife to fetch, no doctor within 50 miles, even in fair weather. In this, they were utterly alone. Holt's practicality was her anchor. He helped her to her new room, built up the fire there until it was blazing, and laid out every clean cloth they had. He boiled water. He melted snow for more. He moved with a quiet, furious efficiency. The storm raged outside, a symphony of despair, while inside, a brutal, intimate struggle began. The labor was long and difficult. The early arrival meant complications. Ilara fought with a primal strength she didn't know she possessed, but as hours bled into a day, her strength began to fail. The cabin grew stiflingly hot, filled with the smell of blood and sweat and pine resin. Holt never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her brow, whispered encouragement in a voice raspy from disuse. "You are the strongest thing I've ever seen," he said once, and the raw truth in it gave her the will for one more push. When the crisis came, it was swift and silent. The baby, a boy, emerged small and frighteningly still. Blue, not crying, Ilara, exhausted beyond comprehension, saw him, and a sound of pure desolation tore from her throat. Holt acted without a second's hesitation. He took the tiny, limp form, cleared its mouth with his finger, and turned it over, patting its back with a touch that was miraculously gentle. Nothing. He looked at Ilara, his own face a mask of anguish, then looked back at the child. He did something then that she would remember forever. He brought the baby to his own face, placed his mouth over the infant's nose and mouth, and breathed. Once, twice. A small, desperate puff of life from a man who dealt in silence. A shudder, a tiny, wet cough, and then a cry, a thin, reedy, furious wail that was the most glorious sound in the history of the world. Color flooded into the tiny cheeks. Holt's shoulders sagged. He gently swaddled the crying infant in a warm cloth and placed him in Ilara's waiting arms. She clutched her son, tears streaming down her face, looking from his perfect, furious features to Holt, who knelt by the bed, his head bowed, his own tears cutting tracks through the grime and soot on his face. He was weeping silently, his big, scarred hands trembling. In that moment, with the storm howling its defeat outside, 3 people in a hand-built room became a family, not by blood, not by law, but by the sheer, stubborn force of will and breath. They had survived the winter, the Vances, and death itself, but as the new mother and her son slept, and Holt kept watch by the fire, a new and terrible truth dawned. The battle for the cabin was over. The war for the future was just beginning. The Vances would hear about the child, and a male heir changed everything. The news of a Vance heir, a son, traveled through Bitter Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. It changed the calculus entirely. For Old Man Vance and Harlan, the child was no longer a complication. He was the ultimate prize, a legitimate blood descendant who could rightfully inherit the entire homestead, locking the land into the Vance name for another generation. Their claim on Ilara morphed from one of dispossession to one of paternalistic concern. They began to speak publicly of their duty to their late brother's child, of the unsuitability of a rough cowboy's shack for a Vance heir. The moral pressure from the town, once based on gossip, now solidified into a judgment. The baby belonged with his family. A formal letter arrived, delivered not by the weary clerk, but by a stern-faced man who introduced himself as an associate of the Vance family's interests. It was a proposal, couched in legal terms. They offered to drop all claims against Ilara for misappropriated property. They would provide a modest annuity for the child's upkeep. In return, she was to relinquish all maternal rights and deliver the infant to their custody. They framed it as an act of charity, saving the boy from a life of squalor and illegitimacy. The unspoken threat beneath the polished words was clear: comply, or they would use the full force of law and social opinion to take him. Ilara read the letter aloud to Holt in their main room, her voice flat. When she finished, she looked at the sleeping infant in the carved cradle Holt had made. "They want my son," she said, the words ash in her mouth. Holt took the letter from her hands, walked to the fire, and fed it to the flames. He watched it curl and blacken. "They'll try," he said. "They won't get him." But the Vances were done with proxies and paper. The final assault began at first thaw, when the roads were rivers of mud. Harlan Vance arrived with their father and a third man, a federal land agent from the territorial office. The agent wore a crisp suit and carried a leather-bound ledger. His presence meant the Vances had escalated to the highest authority they could muster. The 3 men rode into the yard and dismounted without invitation. Holt met them on the porch, his rifle leaning against the doorframe within easy reach. Ilara stood in the doorway of her room, the baby in her arms, her heart a frantic drum against his small body. The land agent spoke first, his tone officious. "Mr. Holt, we are here on a matter of property record and lineal inheritance. There appears to be a minor residing on this claim whose legal guardianship is in question, which bears upon adjacent land titles." He was talking about the baby as if he were a misplaced parcel. Harlan cut in, his eyes fixed on Ilara. "Just give us the boy, Ilara. This can be civil. He'll have a good life. You can even visit." Old Man Vance just stared, his eyes cold and greedy on his grandson. Ilara found her voice thin but steady. "His name is Thomas, and his life is here." Harlan's patience snapped. "This is nonsense. He's a Vance. He deserves his birthright, not this hovel." He gestured contemptuously at the cabin, at the new room, at Holt. That's when Holt spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard like a stone dropped in still water. His birthright, Holt said, looking directly at the land agent, is 160 acres of prime bottomland, Section 7, Township 4 North, the Vance homestead. He paused, letting the specificity land. And his home is here, on my claim, legally filed, taxes paid. The land agent frowned, consulting his ledger. That may be, but the question of the child's residence and welfare is settled, Holt interrupted, not raising his voice. He turned and walked into the cabin. For a terrible moment, Ilara thought he was retreating, but he returned holding a single sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to Harlan or the old man. He walked directly to the land agent and gave it to him. Filed with the county clerk and the territorial registry last week, Holt said. The agent adjusted his spectacles and read. His eyebrows climbed. He looked from the paper to Holt, to Ilara, to the baby, a slow, understanding nod. He handed the paper back to Holt and turned to the Vances. The matter appears to be legally resolved, gentlemen. What? Harlan snarled, grabbing for the paper. Holt held it out, allowing him to see. It was a deed of gift. It legally transferred, for the sum of $1, a parcel of land measuring exactly 1 acre, the very acre upon which the cabin sat, from Holt's claim to one Ilara Vance, widow in perpetuity. It was signed, witnessed, and stamped with an official seal, but that wasn't the masterstroke. The second clause named Holt as the appointed guardian and protector of the minor child, Thomas, with full authority to act in his interests until his majority, at the discretion of the child's mother, the landowner. Holt had not tried to fight them on their terms. He had changed the battlefield. He had made Ilara a landowner in her own right, independent of any marital or widow's status. Her cabin, her room were on her asterisk land, and as the landowner and mother, her choice of guardian for her son was virtually unassailable. By making the 1 acre gift, he had anchored her and the child to a legal reality the Vances could not breach. The child's birthright was secure, and so was his home. They were separate, sovereign entities. Harlan Vance's face purpled with rage. This is a trick, a sham. She can't own property, she's a woman. The land agent gave him a weary look. Married Women's Property Act, Territorial Statute of 1885, sir. She certainly can. The filing is in order. The law, the Vances' favorite weapon, had just been turned against them by a man who supposedly knew only silence and an axe. Old man Vance spoke for the first time, his voice a dry rasp. You think you've won, Cowboy? You think a piece of paper changes what is? That boy is our blood, you're nothing. Holt finally looked at the old man, and his gaze was not one of anger, but of profound pity. You had a daughter-in-law who loved your son, he said, each word deliberate. You had a grandson, and all you saw was acreage. You're the nothing. Defeated by the very institutions they'd sought to wield, the Vances could only retreat. They mounted their horses and rode away, the land agent trailing behind them, already mentally cataloging the next dispute. The war was over. In the quiet that followed, Ilara looked at Holt, the deed still in his hand. You did this last week, he nodded. How you never left? He gave a small, rare shrug. The clerk who brought the letter about my brother. I sent a reply with him, and instructions. He had seen the endgame coming and had moved a piece she didn't know was on the board. The silent man had spoken the language of law and won. That summer, the garden Ilara planted around the cabin did not simply grow, it erupted. In the soil of her own acre, she cultivated a defiant, sprawling oasis. Corn stood tall beside climbing beans. Squash vines spread like green laughter. Sunflowers turned their faces to the sun, taller than a man. It was a testament written in leaves and fruit. Holt built a proper porch, and then a swing for the boy. He taught young Thomas to walk on the solid planks of his mother's land. Years unspooled, marked not by grand events, but by the quiet rhythm of a life hard won. Thomas grew strong, a curious boy with his mother's dark hair and a thoughtful stillness he learned from Holt. He called Holt Pa without prompting, the word emerging naturally as if it had always been true. The Vances, broken and bitter, eventually sold their homestead and moved east. The shadow they cast finally lifted. One evening when Thomas was nearly 10, a well-dressed man arrived in a motorcar, a startling anachronism on their dirt track. He was a surveyor for a railroad company. He spread a map on their kitchen table, pointing to a proposed line that would cut through the foothills, right across the old Vance land, and skirting the edge of Holt's claim. He spoke of progress, of offers, of life-changing money. Holt listened, then walked to the window and looked out at the garden, now being tended by Thomas under Ilara's direction. He looked at the porch swing at the solid, weathered cabin. He turned back to the man. "Not for sale," he said. The man argued, upped his offer. Holt simply repeated, "Not for sale." They never came back. The railroad, when it was built years later, curved respectfully around the ridge, as if daunted by the quiet stubbornness rooted there. Time, the final and gentlest victor, had its way. Ilara's hair silvered. Holt's back, once straight as a lodgepole pine, developed a respectful stoop from decades of labor. Thomas married a bright-eyed schoolteacher from Bitter Creek and built his own house on an adjacent piece of land Holt signed over to him. He brought his children to the cabin every Sunday. The garden, now tended by new, small hands, continued to flourish. Ilara passed first, on a warm spring afternoon with the apple trees in bloom, her hand in Holt's, surrounded by her son and grandchildren. They buried her on her acre, beneath the oldest oak at the garden's edge, as she'd asked. Holt carved her headstone himself. It read only, Elaoavance. She built a home where they said there was none. Holt lived 2 more years. He spent his days on the porch, watching the light move across the land he'd shared. The morning they found him, he was seated in his chair, a half-whittled bird in his lap, facing the garden. They buried him beside her. Thomas, now a man with children of his own, nailed a new sign to the fence post at the entrance to the acre. It didn't have words. It was just the rusted head of his father's broadaxe, mounted on the weathered wood, a symbol understood by everyone who knew the story. The cabin never fell into ruin. Thomas and his family maintained it, and later his children's children. The garden grew wilder, more generous, seeding itself in unexpected places. The story of the pregnant widow and the silent cowboy became local legend, then history, then something closer to myth, a foundational tale of how the West was truly won not by conquest, but by an obstinate, quiet kind of love that could build a room, a home, and a future from nothing but will and weathered pine. The winter of '87 had tried to kill them. Instead, it forged a legacy that outlasted railroads, wars, and the very century itself. All because one man saw a figure in the snow and chose, against every instinct, to not look away. So what remains of that desperate winter, of the silent man and the widow with nothing? Not just a story, but a question etched into the land itself. In an era where women were legally invisible and survival was a transaction, their defiance became a quiet blueprint for a different kind of life. They proved that the most radical act is not always a shout, but sometimes the steady, stubborn work of building a room, of tending a garden, of choosing to stay. The legal doctrine of coverture that left Ilara powerless was being challenged even as she stood in the snow, but change moved slowly across a vast territory. What Holt and Ilara built was a pocket of that future, a space where a woman could own the ground beneath her feet and a man's worth was measured by his hands, not his words. Their story is a footnote in the grand narrative of the West, but it's the footnotes that often tell the real truth. It wasn't gold or glory that settled the hardest lands. It was this, the unbreakable contract between 2 people who refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. The cabin is gone now, reclaimed by the prairie over a century ago. But if you know where to look, you can still find the foundation stones, laid by hand in the dead of winter. The oak tree over their grave still stands, wider now, its branches sheltering a patch of earth where wildflowers bloom with unnatural vigor every spring. And sometimes, when the light is just right at dusk, travelers on the old county road swear they see a ghost of a garden in the empty field, rows of green and gold that shimmer for a moment and then fade, as if the land itself remembers the shape of her hands. Their legacy isn't in deeds or monuments. It's in the quiet understanding that sometimes the family you make is the only one that can save you, that a home isn't a gift the world gives you, but a fortress you build together, log by log, against the cold. In the end, Ilara and Holt didn't just survive a winter. They built a world where love was stronger than law, where a silent promise was more binding than any document, and where a single acre of contested ground became the heart of an empire that outlasted kings. If you found their story moving, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten lives that shaped our history. We uncover the human truths buried beneath the legend. Thanks for watching.